Before you do anything else, go ahead and get comfortable. Pull up your blanket, adjust your pillow. If you have a fan going or some soft background noise, even better. Let the world outside get a little quieter for the next little while. Because tonight, we are going somewhere that feels both very far away and surprisingly close to home. We are going back. Way back. Before school buses, before homework, before classrooms and chalkboards, and rows of little desks bolted to the floor. We are going back to a time when there were no report cards, no teachers standing at the front of a room, no textbooks with worn-out corners, and no bells ringing to tell you that it was time to learn something new. And here is the question we are going to sit with tonight. Gently, slowly, like a hand resting on a calm pond. If there were no schools for most of human history, how did anyone learn anything at all? How did people figure out which plants would heal a wound and which ones would end your life? How did children grow up knowing how to build a fire, how to read the stars, how to grow food, how to make tools, how to sail across open water with no map? How did entire civilizations pass down their history, their values, their hard-won wisdom for thousands and thousands of years, all without a single classroom? The answer, as you are about to discover, is both simple and extraordinary. It is ancient and it is beautiful. And quietly, in ways you might not expect, a lot of it is still happening right now, all around you. So let us begin. Dim the lights if you have not already. Close your eyes whenever you feel ready. And let me take you back. Part 1. The world before classrooms. Picture a world without clocks. That is not so hard. Now picture a world without books. A little harder, but okay. Now picture a world without writing at all. No words scratched into clay, no ink pressed onto paper, no alphabet, no symbols, no way to put a thought down somewhere and look at it again later. This was the world that human beings lived in for the vast majority of their existence on this planet. Scientists and historians who study early humans believe that our species, Homo sapiens, has been around for roughly 300,000 years. For most of that time, there were no cities, no countries, and no schools. People lived in small groups. They moved together across landscapes. They followed animals. They found water. They learned how to stay alive. And they learned. Oh, they learned so much. Think about everything an early human being had to know just to survive a single day. They needed to know which foods were safe to eat and which ones would make them sick or kill them outright. They needed to know how to find water and how to judge whether it was clean enough to drink. They needed to know how to build a shelter that would hold through the cold of night. They needed to know how to make fire, how to use it, how to keep it alive. They needed to know how to track animals through the forest, how to read the broken twig and the muddy print and the faint smell in the air. They needed to know how to make tools out of stone and bone and wood. They needed to know how to work together, how to share, how to speak, how to settle a disagreement, how to care for someone who is hurt or sick. And none of it came from a book. None of it came from a teacher standing at a board. It all came from something much older and much quieter than any of that. It came from watching, from doing, from listening, from being there, right beside the people who already knew and paying attention with your whole body. This is where our story begins, not in a building, not in a lecture, but in the open air, beside a fire, surrounded by the people you love in a world that was both wild and deeply, quietly familiar. Part 2. The very first classroom was the world itself. When a very young child in a hunter-gatherer community woke up in the morning, the first thing they did was not go to school, they did not pack a bag, they did not sit at a desk. They simply went where their family went, saw what their family saw, and did what their family did. And in that simple act of following, everything began. Researchers from University College London have spent years studying hunter-gatherer communities in places like the rainforests of central Congo, where the Bayaka people live in ways that echo how humans have lived for tens of thousands of years. What these researchers found was something both surprising and deeply moving. Children in these communities learn almost entirely through watching and copying. From the earliest age, babies are carried on their mothers' backs during food gathering trips. Toddlers are given tiny versions of adult tools, little digging sticks, small baskets, not as toys in the way we might think of toys, but as real things, meant to be used, meant to be practiced with. A 2-year-old pressing a small stick into the soft earth beside their mother is not playing pretend. They're beginning to learn one of the most important skills of their life. As children get a little older, maybe around 5 or 6, they start moving in mixed-age playgroups. These groups are fascinating. Older children and younger children spend time together, and the older ones naturally pass things on, not by sitting down and explaining, but by sing and letting the younger ones watch and try, and eventually do it too. A 9-year-old showing a 5-year-old how to weave a simple basket, a 12-year-old demonstrating how to move quietly through the underbrush. No formal lesson plan, just life happening and learning happening inside of it. The study found that by the end of what we would call middle childhood, roughly around 10 years old, most hunter-gatherer children were already competent food gatherers. They knew their local environment, they knew which plants were edible and which were not, they knew how to find water, they knew how to contribute to the group. That is not childhood in the background, that is childhood as the very centre of the learning process. And here is the thing that is easy to miss. These children were not being forced or pressured, they wanted to learn, they were drawn to the adults around them the way a small bird is drawn to follow a larger one. The learning happened naturally, almost like breathing. It was not a chore, it was just life. Part 3, the art of watching. There is a kind of learning that does not make any noise at all. Imagine a young boy, maybe 7 years old, sitting quietly at the edge of a clearing. His father is crouching a few feet away, still as a stone, watching the ground. After a long moment, the father reaches down and places his fingers gently beside a faint mark in the soft earth. He studies it. He looks up and scans the tree line. He looks at the sky. Then he rises and moves slowly to the left, following something the boy cannot quite see yet. The boy does not ask questions, he does not interrupt. He watches. He files everything away. The angle of his father's body, the direction of his eyes, the way his breathing slowed before he moved. He stores it all somewhere deep, the way you store a memory that matters. Days later, weeks later, he will be the one crouching at the edge of a clearing, and something in his hands and his eyes will already know what to do, because they watched. This kind of learning through observation is one of the most ancient and powerful forms of human education. Researchers call it observational learning, but really it is something much more primal than any label. It is the simple, ancient act of paying attention to someone who knows more than you do, and letting that knowing pass quietly from them to you. Across dozens of studies of hunter-gatherer communities on multiple continents, researchers have found that observation appears over and over again as the foundation of how children learn practical skills. Young FA children in Central Africa, between the ages of 2 and 3, were observed spending roughly a quarter of their waking time simply watching adult activities. Not playing, not being taught, just watching an entire education unfolding in silence. But it was not just about watching physical skills. Observation also meant watching how people treated each other, how a disagreement was settled, how food was shared when there was not enough, how someone who was afraid was comforted, how the elders in the group moved through the world with a kind of quiet authority that came not from power, but from knowledge. A child growing up in this world was absorbing something far deeper than how to find food. They were absorbing a whole way of being human, and when the time came for them to pass that on to their own children, they would not explain it. They would simply live it, out in the open, where young eyes could see. Part 4. Stories were the first libraries, long before anyone carved a letter into stone. Long before the first written word existed anywhere on Earth, human beings told stories. And those stories were not just entertainment. They were not just something people did around a fire when the work was done. Those stories were the knowledge. They were the science, the history, the map, the medicine, and the moral code all woven together into something that could live in a person's memory and travel through time. Think about what that means for a moment. In a world with no writing, the only way to save a piece of information for future generations was to put it inside a story and hope that story survived. So people got very, very good at making stories that were hard to forget. Myths and legends, which we sometimes look at today as simple fairy tales, were often something much more layered than that. A story about a great flood might carry specific warnings about which rivers were dangerous after heavy rain. A story about a trickster who got punished for disrespecting the elders might encode the community's rules about how young people were expected to behave. A story about a particular mountain being the home of a dangerous spirit might be a very old memory of a volcanic eruption, passed down not as science but as sacred warning. Researchers studying oral societies have found evidence of this again and again. There are Aboriginal Australian stories about landscapes that were swallowed by rising water, stories that match what we now know happened at the end of the last ice age, more than 10,000 years ago, when sea levels rose and reshaped the coastlines of the continent. These stories survived for hundreds of generations, told and retold beside fires and under stars, without a single word ever being written down. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. The Inuit people of the Arctic carried survival information inside their stories. Narratives that taught listeners about hunting techniques, about the behavior of specific animals in specific seasons, about which ice was safe to walk on and which would crack without warning. Those stories were not separable from the knowledge. They were the knowledge made memorable, made human, made possible to pass from one generation to the next. Indigenous communities in Canada describe their oral traditions as something that connects past, present, and future all at once. Stories were told in specific places, at specific times, by specific people who had earned the right to tell them. Some stories could only be heard by certain members of the community. Some could only be told during winter months. The act of telling was never casual. It was always a form of teaching, and the listener was always, in some quiet way, a student. Among the Métis people, older women often held the memory of family genealogies and kinship connections, not written down anywhere, but carried inside oral tradition. This knowledge prevented close relatives from accidentally marrying, outlined which families held which hunting grounds, and mapped out the invisible but deeply important lines of responsibility and relationship that kept the community whole. Among the Aztecs, in what is now Mexico, there was a school called the Calmecac, where students began their education at the age of 10. But the teaching at the Calmecac was not from textbooks. History and law and sacred knowledge were transmitted through oratory, poetry, and music. Students memorized historical accounts by reciting them aloud, using the rhythm and the melody to hold the words in place. There were even simple graphic aids, not quite writing as we know it, but visual guides that helped students navigate their recitations. The goal was not to read about the past. The goal was to become the living container of it. In ancient India, the sacred texts of the Vedas were considered too important to ever be written down, for fear that writing might corrupt them. Instead, generation after generation of students learned to memorize vast quantities of verses with perfect accuracy, using strict rules of recitation that preserved every syllable, every pause, every pitch. The oral tradition was not a lesser substitute for writing. It was considered more reliable. A written text could be miscopied, mistranslated, or destroyed. A living voice, trained carefully, carried something truer. And in a sense, that was not wrong. The Rig Veda, one of the oldest religious texts in the world, was transmitted orally for thousands of years before it was ever written down. And scholars who study it today believe that the oral version, preserved with extraordinary faithfulness, may be among the most accurately transmitted ancient texts we have. Memory was not a limitation. Memory, trained from childhood through story and song and repetition, was one of the most powerful technologies human beings ever developed. Part 5. The Fire Circle and the Quiet Teacher. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. It is evening. The sun has gone down and the air has turned cool. A bunch of people are standing by a small fire. The light flickers orange and gold across their faces. Children are sitting close to the adults, and the adults are close to the elders. Someone older, with grey in their hair and a steadiness in their eyes, begins to speak, and everybody listens. This is one of the oldest educational scenes in human history. The elder by the fire, the circle of listeners, the story beginning to take shape in the warm air. Elders were not just old people in traditional communities. They were libraries. They were archives. They were the living record of everything the community needed to know to survive, to flourish, to understand who they were and where they came from. Their role was not ceremonial. It was practical and urgent. Everything they held inside them needed to get out and into the next generation before they were gone. So they told stories. They answered questions, not always directly, and not always in ways that gave the answer right away. Often the teaching came wrapped inside a riddle, or a metaphor, or a long and winding tale that seemed at first to be about something else entirely, but which by the end had quietly placed a piece of wisdom somewhere inside the listener that would stay there for a lifetime. Among many indigenous cultures in North America, questions were answered in stories. If a young person came to an elder wanting to understand how to handle conflict, the elder might not give a list of instructions. They might tell a story about a hawk and a rabbit, or a river that split around a stone, and the young person would sit with that story and turn it over, and eventually find their own answer inside it. This was not a slower or less effective way to teach. It was, in many ways, a deeper one. The listener had to do the work of understanding. And the things we work to understand, we remember. The firelight was the classroom, the elder was the teacher, the story was the textbook, the lesson plan, and the exam all at once. And the student was not sitting passively, scribbling notes. The student was leaning forward, watching the elder's face and feeling the story land in their chest, and storing it in a place much deeper than the kind of short-term memory that gets used on tests and then forgotten. This is part of why oral traditions were so durable. They did not just put information into the mind, they put it into the body, into the feeling, into the identity of the person who heard them. A story you heard at 7 years old, sitting beside a fire, watching the face of someone you loved and trusted, does not go away easily. It stays. Part 6. Learning by doing. The long road of the apprentice. Now let us travel forward in time just a little. We are moving from the world of the hunter-gatherer into the world of settled civilizations, into villages and towns and the slow, rich growth of human craft. Because as people began to stay in one place, to farm, to build, to make things, a new form of education took shape. It did not happen in a school, it happened in a workshop, in a smithy, in a pottery studio, in a healer's garden, in a master carpenter's barn. It happened through apprenticeship. The word apprentice comes from an old French word that means someone who is learning to grasp something, or someone who is being grasped by something. And that feeling, of being held by a craft, of being slowly taken in by it over years, is exactly what the apprentice system was about. Here is how it worked in medieval Europe, and in dozens of other cultures across history. A boy, and sometimes a girl, though the records are less clear on this, would be placed in the care of a master craftsman somewhere around the age of 12. This was not just a job, it was a total way of life. The apprentice would live in the master's house, eat at the master's table, and work in the master's workshop every single day. The apprenticeship lasted anywhere from 2 to 7 years, sometimes longer for especially demanding trades. For the first months, the apprentice might do almost nothing that looked like learning a craft at all. They would sweep the floor, they would clean tools, they would run errands and fetch materials and watch, always watch, as the master and the older apprentices did their work. This was not wasted time, even though it might have felt that way. Every sweeping motion, every time they picked up a tool to clean it, every minute spent watching the master's hands move was quietly training the eye and the body for what was coming. Then gradually, the master would begin to include them. First small tasks. Help me hold this piece steady, sand this edge down, watch how I do this joint. Now you try. The feedback was immediate and real. There was no grade, there was no written test. There was the master's eye watching the work and the master's hands, sometimes reaching over to show the right angle or the right pressure, and the growing understanding in the apprentice that they were getting closer to something, that their hands were beginning to know things their mind could not yet explain. In medieval Europe, craftsmen organized themselves into groups called guilds. There were guilds for bakers and weavers and goldsmiths and masons and candle makers and shoemakers and dozens of other trades. At one point in a major city, there could be as many as 100 different guilds. The guild set the rules for apprenticeship, how long it would last, what the master was required to teach, what the apprentice was required to do in return. They created a ladder. Apprentice, then journeyman, then master. A journeyman was someone who had finished their basic apprenticeship and was now travelling, literally, from workshop to workshop, from city to city, learning from different masters, building their skills, building their reputation. The word journeyman comes from the French word for day, because journeymen were paid by the day. They were skilled but not yet established. They were still moving through the world, still learning, still becoming. To become a master, a journeyman eventually had to create what was called a masterpiece. This was a single piece of work, a chair, a lock, a piece of fabric, a loaf of bread shaped just so, that demonstrated full command of the craft. Other masters in the guild would examine it, judge it, and vote on whether the journeyman had reached the level needed to open their own shop and take on their own apprentices. This system had a beauty to it that is easy to miss if you think of it only in practical terms. It was not just about transferring skills, it was about an issue that is more personal and more human. For years, the master and apprentice stood side by side. They worked side by side in the close quarters of a workshop, season after season. The master knew the apprentice's strengths and weaknesses better than a teacher ever could know a student in a classroom of 30. The teaching was tailored, alive, responsive. When the apprentice struggled, the master adjusted. When the apprentice excelled, the master pushed harder. And somewhere in those years of work, something happened that cannot be fully described in any textbook. The craft got into the apprentice's hands. Not just the knowledge of it, the feel of it. A skilled blacksmith does not think about each hammer strike. Their body knows where to hit and how hard. A master weaver does not count the threads. Their fingers read the fabric the way eyes read words. This embodied knowledge, knowledge that lives in the muscles and the bones, can only be learned by doing. It cannot be read. It cannot be taught in a lecture. It can only be earned through years of practice, guided by someone who already carries it. Part 7. The Scribes of Ancient Egypt. When writing was a sacred skill, let us move now to one of the most magnificent civilizations in human history, to the banks of the Great Nile River, to the land of pyramids and pharaohs and secrets carved into stone for thousands of years, ancient Egypt. For the vast majority of Egyptians, the farmers, the fishermen, the weavers, the merchants, education worked exactly the way we have already described. A boy learned his father's trade by working beside him from childhood. A girl learned from her mother, absorbing the knowledge of household management, cooking, medicine-making, and in royal families, even reading and writing. Knowledge passed hand to hand, generation to generation, in the fields and kitchens and workshops of everyday life. But Egypt also had something unusual for the ancient world. It had writing. And because it had writing, it had a class of people whose entire purpose was to master it. They were called scribes, and they were among the most important people in Egyptian society. The Egyptian writing system, hieroglyphics, was not simple. It consisted of more than 700 different symbols, each one representing a different word, sound, or concept. Learning to read and write hieroglyphics took years of dedicated study, and so, for wealthy families who wanted their sons to rise in society, to work as government officials, temple administrators, tax collectors, or record keepers, there were schools specifically designed to create scribes. Most scribal students began their formal training around the age of 9 or 10, though they might have started learning basics at home with their mothers from the age of 4 or 5. The training could last a decade. Students practiced first on limestone chips called ostraca, which were abundant near the desert edge and served as a kind of ancient scrap paper. When a student finally demonstrated enough skill, they were allowed to write on papyrus, an honour, because papyrus was expensive and precious. The curriculum was demanding. Students spent hours and hours every day copying texts, not random texts, carefully chosen examples from classic literature, letters, and instructional wisdom that were meant to train not just the hand, but the character. There was a famous text called the Kemet, which served as a kind of all-purpose teaching tool, and another called the Instructions of Any, full of advice about how a scribe should live his life, how to treat his mother, how to behave with dignity, how to be the kind of person who was worthy of the skill he was being given. An old Egyptian proverb captured the school philosophy perfectly. A boy's ear is on his back. He listens when he is beaten. Not exactly the gentle, nurturing image of modern education, but it tells you something about how seriously this training was taken. The scribes were the gatekeepers of knowledge in a society where perhaps only 1 or 2% of the population could read at all. The literacy rate among ordinary farmers and workers was essentially zero. Everything they needed to know came from oral tradition, from watching and doing, from family and community. The world of the written word was another world entirely, one that most people never entered. But here is the remarkable thing. In ancient Egypt, just as in every other civilization, both worlds worked. The farmer who could not read a single word still knew exactly how to manage their irrigation canals, when to plant and when to harvest, how to predict the Nile's flood season, how to care for their animals, how to negotiate fairly at market. They carried all of this inside them, not on paper, and generation after generation, for thousands of years, the farming knowledge of Egypt survived, passed from parent to child in the open air, without a single written word. Part 8. Ancient Greece, where questions were the lesson. Now we travel to a place where the warm Mediterranean sun falls across white stone, where olive trees grow thick on hillsides, and where men in robes gather in the open air not to build or to farm but to talk. Ancient Greece, the Greeks, particularly the Athenians of the classical period, around 500 to 300 BCE, developed an approach to learning that was unlike almost anything that had come before it. For most boys of wealthy families, early education involved physical training, running, wrestling, gymnastics, alongside music, poetry, and basic reading and writing. The goal was not just to produce skilled workers, the goal was to produce good citizens, men who could think, speak, argue, and contribute to the civic life of the city. And then there was a man named Socrates. Socrates was born in Athens around 470 BCE. He was not wealthy, he did not run a school in any formal sense, He wrote nothing down, not a single word that we know of. Everything we know about him comes from his students, especially a younger man named Plato, who recorded Socrates' conversations in a series of writings called the Dialogues. What made Socrates unusual was not what he knew, it was how he taught. He did not lecture. He did not stand at the front of a room and tell people what was true. Instead, he walked through the streets of Athens and started conversations. He would approach someone, a politician, a craftsman, a soldier, and ask them what seemed like a simple question. What is justice? What is courage? What does it mean to be good? The person would answer confidently. And then Socrates would ask another question gently, almost innocently, poking at the edges of what they had said. And then another, and another. And slowly, cautiously, the person would begin to realize that they did not actually know the answer as well as they thought they did. Their confident definition would start to unravel. Contradictions would appear, and in that uncomfortable space between what they thought they knew and what they actually understood, real thinking would begin. This method, asking questions to draw out thinking rather than filling people up with answers, became known as the Socratic method. It is still taught in law schools and philosophy programs today, more than 2,400 years later. Socrates thought knowledge came from within rather than outside. It was something already present inside every human being waiting to be uncovered. The teacher's job was not to fill the empty vessel. The teacher's job was to help the student find what was already there. This was a revolutionary idea, and it was completely at odds with the way most ancient education worked, where learning meant memorization and repetition and obedience to the teacher's authority. Plato was Socrates' most impressive pupil and extended these concepts even further. In 387 BC, he established the Academy in Athens, which was the first school of higher learning in the Western world. At the Academy, students did not just memorize knowledge, they debated ideas, they asked questions, they argued with each other and with their teachers. The goal was not to produce scribes or craftsmen or soldiers, but to produce thinkers who could grapple with the most fundamental questions of human life. Plato's student Aristotle went even further. Plato believed the most advanced level of understanding was abstract and philosophical thought, but that was the last thing that Aristotle was interested in. He studied the world around him, including animals and plants and the cosmos. He understood the world was built on observation and not just on abstract thought. He is called the father of the scientific method. Aristotle built his principles on the basis of first-hand observations and the world that was real. Together, these three men, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, created a tradition of learning that was about asking questions, not just receiving answers, a tradition that placed thinking at the center of education, a tradition that took education out of the workshop and the field and placed it in conversation, in the open air, between people willing to be uncertain, willing to be wrong, willing to keep following the question wherever it led. Part 9, The Ancient World Across 4 Civilizations. Let us travel wider now. Let us visit 4 corners of the ancient world and see how education looked from each of them. First, let us go east to China. Ancient China had one of the most interesting educational systems of the ancient world, one built entirely around a single powerful idea, that the purpose of education was to produce good people, and that good people were the foundation of good government. This philosophy came largely from a man named Confucius, who lived around 550 to 479 BCE. Confucius had a similar belief when it came to knowledge and virtue. Understanding the world only as an abstract thought was not the end of learning. It was about becoming a better person, a more honest and respectful citizen of the world and family. From around the 13th century onward in Chinese households, the 3-character classic was used to teach virtue and civic duty to the children. These were short and concise phrases, with the purpose of making the recitation. The 3-character classic is a text of Chinese history and Confucian values and grammar. Families used to recite the text and practice oral recitation. The families eventually used oral recitation of classical texts, not just as a teaching method, but a part of the family tradition. It was a cultural act. In a world where most people could not read, the ability to carry important texts inside your voice and share them with others gave you a kind of social and moral authority. The person who had memorized the classics was not just educated. They were, in a real sense, a living library of what their civilization valued most. Now let us cross the ocean, to the lands of the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca. The Aztec civilization existed from the 14th century to the 16th century in central Mexico. What made the Aztecs interesting was their value for education across all social classes. Out of all the ancient empires, The Aztecs seemed to believe all children, regardless of their social classes, should attend school. Most students went to community schools and learned about their culture's dances, history, chants, and ceremonies. The children of the nobility and the future priests attended the Kalmakak, the most prestigious school. Students took formal, structured education and memorization of history, chants, and poetry. They learned about astronomy, the law, and medicine. They learned to understand and fulfill their social responsibilities with discipline and devotion. The Inca civilization, which ruled an enormous stretch of South America from roughly 1400 to 1533 CE, is especially fascinating because the Inca had no known writing system at all. A civilization that stretched for thousands of miles and administered millions of people, doing so without written language. The Incas lived at the same time as the Aztecs, but their education system was different. They used something called quipu, a system of knotted strings that used different types and placements of knots to convey numbers and potentially stories. Administrators, called quipucamayok, were specially trained to read and create these knot records. Their training was long and demanding, passed directly from one generation of quipucamayok to the next through close personal instruction. The knowledge of how to read the strings was held in living people, in human hands, not on any surface that could be lost. Most Inca citizens, however, learned through oral tradition and vocational apprenticeship. Farmers learned from farmers, weavers learned from weavers. The extraordinary textile work of the Inca, fabrics so finely woven that modern looms have struggled to reproduce them, was taught hand to hand, pattern by pattern, generation by generation, without a single instruction manual ever being written. And now, let us go south and east, to Africa. Across the vast and diverse continent of Africa, education took as many forms as there were communities. Something that arranged education systems properly was that of initiation ceremonies in some certain African cultures. They marked the transition of their children to their adulthood. These ceremonies were not just rituals, they were educational events. Before and during the initiation period, young people received intensive instruction in the knowledge their community considered most essential, the history of their people, the responsibilities of adulthood, the skills needed for the role they would play in the community's life. In some communities, this instruction happened in what scholars have called African oral academies, gatherings where elders taught in a format of question and answer, where the knowledge of animals, weather, rivers, hunting, and history was transmitted through the structured interplay of the question and response. The ceremony gave weight to the teaching. It said, "This is important, this matters, pay attention, you will carry this." The knowledge passed at these ceremonies covered medicine, ecology, astronomy, agriculture, social ethics, and the sacred narratives that explained the community's relationship with the world. It was not fragmentary or casual, it was organized, comprehensive, and ancient, and it survived not because it was written down, but because it was considered too important not to pass on. Part 10. How Children Learned Through Play. Let us pause here and rest in something softer for a moment. Because there is one form of learning that cuts across every culture in human history, in every corner of the globe, in every century from the earliest humans to today. Children learn through play. This sounds simple. It sounds almost too obvious to mention. But what researchers have found when they actually sit down and study how children in pre-modern societies use play is something both unexpected and deeply reassuring. Play is not a break from learning. Play is learning in its purest form. In hunter-gatherer societies, children's toys were miniature versions of adult tools, small bows, little baskets, tiny digging sticks. Children did not use these to pretend they were adults. They used them to actually begin being adults, in a small, safe way. They practiced the motions. They tried and failed and tried again. They competed with other children and learned to lose gracefully and win without cruelty. They built small shelters and caught small animals and gathered small amounts of food. All of this play had a shape and a direction, even when it felt completely free and unstructured. Anthropologist research, published in scientific journals, has confirmed something that generations of grandmothers already knew, that children who played freely, who were allowed to try and fail and try again, who mixed with older and younger children rather than only their exact peers, develop complex practical skills faster and more durably than children who were only told what to do. The mixed-age play group was especially powerful. A 4-year-old watching a 9-year-old figure out how to do something is receiving one of the best lessons possible. The 9-year-old is close enough in size and experience that the task seems achievable, close enough in memory to still remember learning it themselves, and motivated enough by the admiration of a younger child to actually demonstrate it clearly. And play was not only about physical skills. Games in ancient cultures were often layered with ethical and social lessons. A game that required taking turns, sharing, or negotiating disagreements taught children how to be part of a community. A storytelling game where children had to remember and retell a tale reinforced memory. A game that involved naming stars or plants or animal tracks was essentially a quiz in disguise, one that nobody dreaded because it felt like play. Children do not need to be forced to learn, they are biologically designed to learn. Their curiosity is so strong, so persistent, so natural, that in most cultures before formal schools existed, the harder task was not motivating children to pay attention, but simply ensuring that what was around them to pay attention to was worth their time. The world itself was enough. Part 11. How ancient healers memorized the forest. There is a quiet art that is older than any school, older than any civilization, older perhaps even than language itself, the art of knowing plants. In the dense forest by the river's edge, on the slopes of a mountain, wherever plants grew, human beings were watching them, tasting them carefully, observing what happened when they were applied to a wound or brewed into a drink, noting which ones made people sleep and which ones woke them up, which ones eased pain and which ones caused it, which ones killed slowly and which ones cured. This knowledge, traditional plant medicine, was not random guessing. It was the accumulated result of thousands of years of careful, methodical, passed-down observation. And it was taught in one of the oldest and most intimate ways that knowledge has ever been taught, through relationship. In many traditional healing traditions, the healer of a village did not work with dozens and dozens of plants. They worked deeply with a small number, perhaps only 2 or 3 over the course of a lifetime. They knew these plants with an intimacy that is hard to describe in modern terms, the way a plant grew in different soils, how its properties shifted with the seasons, which parts of the plant held healing power, and which were useless or dangerous. This knowledge did not come from a textbook. It came from years of close observation, guided by a more experienced healer who passed it on directly. A healer's apprentice spent years following their teacher, learning not just which plant to use for which ailment, but when to harvest it, how to prepare it, how much to give, and crucially, when not to use it at all. The transmission was personal, tactile, relational. A young healer did not learn from words alone. They learned from touch, how a leaf felt between their fingers, how a root smelled when it was freshly dug, how a prepared remedy looked and tasted when it was right. They learned from presence, sitting beside an elder healer as they worked, watching how they assessed a patient, how they listened, how they made decisions. The Ebers Papyrus, written by Egyptian physicians around 1550 BCE, contains more than 700 medicinal formulas. The first written record of medicinal plants in Mesopotamia is even older, clay tablets from over 5,000 years ago listing dozens of plant-based remedies. But these written records were not the beginning of the knowledge. They were only the first attempt to capture, in writing, something that had been taught and passed on orally for countless generations before anyone thought to write it down. The knowledge of plants that eventually filled monastery gardens in medieval Europe, that eventually became the pharmacology of the modern world, all of it started in a forest with someone watching and someone else teaching them how to see. Part 12. The stars were a classroom without walls. If you have ever stood outside on a very clear night, far from the city lights, and looked up at the sky, you know what ancient people saw every single night of their lives. Thousands of stars, scattered across the darkness like thrown sand, forming shapes, tracing paths, rising and setting, with a reliability that made them the most trustworthy clock and compass the world has ever known. For people who lived and travelled without the technology we carry in our pockets today, the sky was everything. It told you which direction you were going. It told you what time of year it was. It told you when to plant and when to harvest. It told you, if you were crossing open ocean with no land in sight, where you were. And learning to read it was a profound education. The Polynesian people of the Pacific Ocean were, without question, some of the greatest navigators in the history of the world. Starting perhaps 3,000 years ago, Polynesian sailors crossed the vast Pacific in double-hulled canoes, reaching islands separated by thousands of miles of open ocean. They reached Hawaii, they reached New Zealand, they reached Easter Island, they may have reached the coast of South America. They did all of this without a compass, without a sextant, without a clock, without a map, What they had was a living, breathing, completely internalized knowledge of the sky and the sea, passed from master navigator to student over years of intensive, demanding training. The star compass that Polynesian navigators used was not a physical object. It was a mental map. A navigator in training would memorize the rising and setting points of specific stars along the horizon, learning each one until it was as familiar as the face of a friend. The Hawaiian star compass, developed by master navigator Nainoa Thompson in the 20th century, based on ancient techniques, divides the horizon into 32 points, or houses, each associated with specific stars and planets. A trained navigator could read the waves with their body, lying flat on the hull of the canoe and feeling the direction of the ocean swell through their spine. They could read the clouds, which formed in predictable patterns over islands, and could spot land from far beyond the visible horizon by watching where birds flew in the evening, knowing the birds were returning to land. They could judge their latitude from the angle of certain stars above the horizon. They could track the colour of the water, the temperature, the presence of certain fish. Every moment of the voyage was a continuous act of reading. This knowledge was not written. It was sung, chanted, memorized, practiced on small local voyages before longer ones, and ultimately proven on the open ocean, where error was not a matter of a wrong answer on a test, but of life and death. The teaching happened aboard the canoe. It happened in the nights of practice lying under the open sky and mapping the stars into memory. It happened in the correction of an elder navigator, not with a harsh word, but with a quiet redirection, a turned head, a pointing finger at the horizon. When the European explorer James Cook encountered the Polynesian navigator Tupaia in 1769, he was astonished to discover that Tupaia could always point in the exact direction of his home island of Tahiti, no matter where their voyage had taken them. Cook, with all his charts and instruments, could not understand how Tupaia did it. It was not magic. It was a form of knowledge so deep, so fully embodied, that it had become second nature, as natural as knowing which way your own front door faces. Tupaia died before Cook could fully document his techniques. A whole library of navigational knowledge, kept not in any book but in one man's mind, was gone. It is one of history's quiet tragedies. But the tradition survived in other navigators, other islands, other lineages of teaching that stretched across the great ocean. And in the late 20th century, Polynesian people worked hard to revive and reconstruct these techniques, not from books, but from the remaining living knowledge of master navigators like Maupiai Lug of the island of Satawal, who had preserved the old ways and was willing to teach them again. Knowledge passed from mind to mind, from sea to sea, across centuries of darkness and light and stars and wind. Part 13, The Medieval Apprentice's Quiet Routine. Let us come back now to the cobblestone streets of medieval Europe, to the smell of bread from a bakery and iron from a smithy and wet wool from a weaver's workshop, to the sound of hammers and the creak of cartwheels on uneven stone. And let us imagine a boy named Thomas, 12 years old, on his first morning as an apprentice to a master carpenter in a small town in England, in roughly the year 1300. Thomas has never held a proper woodworking tool in his life. He comes from a farming family, and his father has made arrangements with the master carpenter, a respected member of the local carpenters' guild, for Thomas to be taken on. There was paperwork, a contract, signed by the master and Thomas's parents, witnessed by the guild. The contract spelled out what the master was required to teach, how long the apprenticeship would last, 7 years, and what Thomas was required to do in return. He would work, he would obey, he would not leave to work for anyone else, he would be for 7 years, in the care and under the authority of the master. His first morning, Thomas sweeps the floor. He sweeps it very carefully because the sawdust and wood chips that seem like nothing are actually a fire hazard, and the master's workshop is full of tools that have taken years and considerable money to acquire. While he sweeps, he watches. The master is working at the bench, making a joint for a door frame. His hands move with a confidence that Thomas cannot yet understand. The chisel seems to know where to go. The mallet strikes in a rhythm that sounds casual but is, Thomas will eventually learn, precisely calibrated to the grain and hardness of the wood. Thomas says nothing. He watches. By the second week, the master lets Thomas handle some of the smaller tools. He shows Thomas how to hold a saw, not gripping tight, which leads to trembling and imprecision, but loose and guiding, letting the saw's weight do most of the work. Thomas tries, the cut veers. The master does not sigh or roll his eyes. He simply reaches over, adjusts Thomas's grip and says, "Try again. This will be the shape of every day for years. Watch, try, fail, adjustle, try again. The wood is unforgiving and honest. A joint that is even slightly off will show in the finished product. There is no partial credit. By the end of the first year, Thomas can sharpen tools, prepare wood properly, make simple straight cuts reliably, and name every tool in the workshop and explain its purpose. He's nowhere near a carpenter, but he is beginning. By the end of 3 years, he can make simple furniture, a stool, a small chest, a plain cabinet door. His hands have started to develop something the master calls feel, an intuitive sense of how much pressure to apply, how wood will respond to different cuts, what a quality piece of work feels like before it is finished. By the end of 7 years, Thomas will know things that cannot be put into words. He will know how oak behaves differently from ash, how humidity changes a piece of wood's dimensions, how the grain of a particular plank can be read like a face to predict where it might split. He will know the satisfaction of a perfect joint and the quiet shame of a careless mistake. He will have worked beside the master in every season, in cold and heat, on simple tasks and demanding ones. He will have watched the master solve problems he did not know had solutions, and when his apprenticeship is over and he's ready to become a journeyman, what he carries will not fit in any bag. It will be in his hands, in his eyes, in the measured patience he has developed, the patience of someone who has learned that good work cannot be rushed. That is an education. Part 14, when knowledge could disappear. We have been spending a lot of time celebrating all the ways human beings learned before schools, and there is much to celebrate. The ingenuity, the creativity, the deep human connection involved in passing knowledge from one person to another, it is genuinely remarkable. But we should also sit quietly for a moment with the other side of this story, because there was a shadow to all of this, a vulnerability that was very real, and it is worth acknowledging honestly. When knowledge lives only in people, it can die with people. A navigator like Tapaya, carrying the accumulated wisdom of generations, dies of disease at 35, and that particular thread of knowledge is cut. A village healer who has spent 40 years learning the properties of every plant in a 10-mile radius dies suddenly, and no one else had learned what she knew, because there was only ever supposed to be one of her, passing her knowledge to one apprentice at a time. A story that has been told correctly for 300 generations gets told one time by someone who misremembers a crucial detail, and the error enters the tradition and cannot be corrected because there is no written record to check against. A community is uprooted, scattered, their elders separated from their children. And the children grow up without access to the knowledge that the elders held, knowledge that was never written down because it never needed to be, because it was always supposed to be spoken. These are not hypothetical scenarios. They happened. They happen. Beyond seizing land and resources, European colonizers disrupted centuries-old oral traditions that preserved knowledge in the Americas, Australia, and Africa. Elders were separated from children, languages were forbidden, ceremonies were outlawed, storytelling traditions were disrupted. The oral libraries that communities had built over generations were burned not with fire, but with silence, with displacement, with the deliberate destruction of the conditions that made oral learning possible. What was lost is genuinely incalculable. Plant knowledge that could have saved lives, navigation techniques that defied what modern engineers thought was possible, historical memories stretching back thousands of years, languages that encoded ways of understanding the world that simply do not exist in any other tongue. Even within civilizations that were not disrupted by outside forces, knowledge loss was always a risk. History is full of the moments where a craft fell out of fashion and disappeared, where the last person who knew how to make a particular kind of die or forge a specific type of blade died without teaching anyone else, and the knowledge simply ceased to exist, not recorded anywhere, not recoverable from anywhere, just gone. This vulnerability was one of the reasons that, as civilizations grew more complex, more people became interested in writing things down, not to replace oral tradition, but to supplement it, to create a second copy, a backup, something that could survive when the human carriers of knowledge could not. The scribes of Egypt were not just record keepers, they were a form of backup system. When a piece of medical knowledge was written onto papyrus and placed in a temple library, it became slightly less dependent on the fragile continuity of any single human teacher and student. The monks of medieval Europe, who sat in cold stone rooms for years carefully copying ancient texts by hand, letter by letter, were doing something similar. They were preserving knowledge that might otherwise have vanished when the last person who held it in memory died. Part 15, Education as Status, the shadow side of the old world. There is something else worth sitting with quietly. In most of the ancient world, education was not available to everyone. It was not that knowledge was intentionally withheld from ordinary people. It was more subtle than that. The depth and breadth of education you received depended almost entirely on who your parents were, where you were born, what your social position was, and often whether you were a boy or a girl. In ancient Egypt, almost all scribes were male. The few percent of the population who could read were predominantly from wealthy or powerful families. A farmer's son born in a rural village might be born with a mind capable of extraordinary things, a gift for mathematics, a love of language, a memory like a trap, and spend his entire life ploughing fields and never know what he might have been, because the path to that knowledge simply did not exist for someone in his position. In medieval Europe, the guilds were powerful protections for the craftsmen who belonged to them, but they also controlled access. If your family could not arrange or afford an apprenticeship with a master in the right guild, you were locked out of certain trades entirely. Women were largely excluded from formal guild membership, though many women worked and learned crafts alongside their husbands and fathers in informal ways. In ancient Greece, the philosophical tradition of Socrates and Plato was built on a foundation of slavery. The leisure that allowed wealthy Athenian men to spend their days in philosophical conversation was made possible by the labour of enslaved people who had no access to any of it. The democracy of Athens, for all its brilliance, applied only to free male citizens. Women, enslaved people, and foreigners were excluded. In societies built around oral tradition, access to knowledge depended heavily on which family you were born into. Certain stories, certain healing knowledge, certain navigation techniques were held by specific families or specific ceremonial roles, and if you were not born into or chosen by the right lineage, you did not receive them. This is not a small thing. For thousands of years, across virtually every human society, the depth of your education depended more on who you were born to than on what you were capable of. The child of a blacksmith became a blacksmith. The child of a farmer became a farmer. The child of a king might become a philosopher or a general. The child of an enslaved person might become nothing officially, even if they quietly learned everything around them and carried more practical wisdom in their hands than the philosophers ever held in their heads. This was one of the quiet promises of the school, the public school, the kind that did not yet exist for most of human history. The promise that it did not matter whose child you were, that you would get the same chance as everyone else, that the only thing that limited what you could learn was your own effort and ability. Of course, the reality of schooling never fully lived up to that promise. Inequalities followed children into schools as they still do today. But the idea was there, the aspiration was there, and it was genuinely new. Part 16. How memory became a superpower, something that is important to understand about all of these ancient learners. The hunter-gatherers, the apprentice, the storytellers, the navigators, the scribes, the healers, is that their memories work differently than ours do. Not better, exactly. Not worse, but differently. Shaped by different demands and different training. When you do not have access to a phone that can look up any fact in seconds, when you do not have a notebook where you can write things down and look them up later, when you cannot search your email for that thing someone told you 6 months ago, memory becomes something you cultivate consciously, deliberately, carefully, the way a farmer cultivates soil. Ancient cultures developed extraordinarily sophisticated techniques for building and maintaining memory. The use of rhythm and rhyme in oral traditions was not just aesthetic, it was functional. Rhythm makes things stick. The reason we can all remember the words to songs we have not heard in years but cannot remember what we ate for lunch last Tuesday is not an accident. Rhythm and melody create a kind of cognitive scaffolding that holds words in place. Ancient Greeks used a technique called the method of loci, sometimes called the memory palace, which involves mentally placing pieces of information at specific locations along a familiar path or inside a familiar building, and then mentally walking through that path to retrieve them. A student who needed to memorize a long speech would mentally place each point of the speech at a specific doorway or corner along a route they knew well, and then mentally walk the route to recall the speech in order. This technique is still taught to memory champions today and has been shown in numerous studies to dramatically improve recall. In cultures where apprentices learned crafts, the memory was not verbal at all, it was physical. The hands remembered, the body remembered. Ask a skilled carpenter today to explain exactly how they know when a joint is right, and they will struggle to put it into words, but put a piece of wood in their hands and the knowledge is immediately there, immediate and unerring. In societies built on oral tradition, certain people, the designated memory keepers, the elders, the bards, the griots of West Africa, the skalds of Norse culture, the rhapsodes of ancient Greece, trained their memories from childhood with an intensity that we would find astonishing. A West African griot, a professional storyteller and historian, was expected to memorize the complete genealogical history of the noble families they served, going back hundreds of years, along with the history of their region, the stories of important battles and alliances, and a vast repertoire of songs and poems. This was their profession, their sacred duty and their identity. Their memory was not a personal gift, it was a community resource, and they protected it accordingly. Part 17. The Coming of Schools, a World Beginning to Change, everything we have talked about so far. The observation, the storytelling, the apprenticeship, the memory, the stars, the plants, the fire circles. This was the education of humanity for nearly all of human history, and then, slowly, gradually, over centuries and across different cultures, something began to change. As human communities grew larger, as cities developed, as governments became more complex and trade extended across vast distances, something new became necessary. A farmer who needed to know how to grow wheat could learn everything he needed by watching his father in the field. But a government administrator who needed to coordinate the movement of goods across an empire, collect taxes from thousands of people, communicate with officials hundreds of miles away, well, that person needed something the field could not teach. They needed to read. They needed to write. They needed to do mathematics. And the knowledge needed for these tasks was too abstract, too symbol-based, to be transmitted by watching and doing. It had to be taught more formally. It had to be taught from texts and symbols by people who already knew them well, to people who did not yet know them at all. This was the beginning of formal schools. The earliest formal school we have clear evidence of was in ancient Egypt, developed sometime around 2000 to 2100 BCE, and it was for scribes. In Mesopotamia, what is now Iraq, there were schools called Adaba, meaning house of tablets, as early as 2500 BCE. Students there learned cuneiform writing, mathematics and literature by practicing on clay tablets. This was not education for everyone. It was education for the small percentage of the population who would need to read and write to do specific important jobs. In China, schools for the nobility existed as far back as the Xia dynasty, around 2070 BCE. Confucian philosophy eventually created a system of education built around classical texts, virtue, and the cultivation of good character, and later, the Tang dynasty's imperial examination system, which began in 605 CE and lasted in various forms for 1,300 years, created something genuinely remarkable, a pathway by which any man, regardless of his family's status, could potentially rise to high government office if he was smart enough and worked hard enough to master the classical curriculum. This was not universal education. But it was meritocracy, or something closer to it than almost anything the ancient world had seen before. By the medieval period in Europe, churches and cathedrals ran schools for boys who had become priests or administrators. These were the first schools many ordinary European children had any access to at all, and even then, the access was limited, and the curriculum was primarily religious. The idea of compulsory schooling, the idea that every child, regardless of background, had both the right and the obligation to receive a formal education, did not really take shape until the 19th century. In Prussia, in the early 1800s, a system of compulsory schooling was introduced that many historians see as the direct ancestor of the modern school system. The Prussian model was not originally designed for intellectual freedom or personal flourishing. It was designed, quite practically, to produce obedient citizens and disciplined soldiers. Children sat in rows. They were taught by a teacher at the front of the room. They moved through a standardized curriculum on a standardized schedule. The goal was uniformity, predictability, a reliably trained population. This model spread to the United States, where Horace Mann, Secretary of Education in Massachusetts in the 1830s and 1840s, championed the idea of publicly funded common schools open to all children. To Japan, which after 1868 rapidly built a Western-style public education system as part of its modernization project. To countries around the world, as industrialization created both the economic need for a literate workforce and the wealth to build schools and pay teachers. The first compulsory education law in the United States was passed in Massachusetts in 1852. It required children between 8 and 14 to attend school for at least 3 months of the year. Just 3 months. Within a few generations, that requirement had expanded to cover all children, all year, through their teenage years. And now, here we are. Most of us grew up sitting in classrooms, reading textbooks, taking tests, writing essays, following a schedule that told us where to go and what to learn at every hour of the day. Part 18, The Hero Returns, What the Old Ways Teach Us Now. We have come a long way tonight. We started in a forest, watching a child learn to follow their parents' footsteps. We travelled through thousands of years of stories told by firelight, of hands trained in workshops, of memory built like a cathedral inside a human mind, of stars mapped into a sailor's blood. And now we are here, in the present, in a world full of schools and screens and instant access to more information than any human being in history ever had to deal with. And yet, the things that made ancient learning powerful have not gone away. They are still inside us. They still work the way they always worked. Children still learn fastest by watching and copying the people around them. The child who grows up watching their parents cook becomes a better cook than the child who only reads recipes. The student who has a mentor who actually works in their field learns more in 6 months than they might in years of classroom instruction alone. The knowledge that lives in the hands and the body, the knowledge of how to do, not just how to describe, still can only be built through practice, through repetition, through getting it wrong and trying again. Stories are still the most powerful way to make information stick. The facts we remember most vividly are almost always wrapped in a story. The teacher we remember most fondly is almost always the one who told the best stories. The information that shaped who we are is almost never the kind we memorized for a test. It is the kind that came to us as a narrative, with characters and conflict and a moment of understanding that felt like something landing in the chest. Memory trained deliberately and carefully is still one of the most powerful tools a person can develop. The techniques ancient cultures used, rhythm, place, repetition, emotional association, are all still validated by modern neuroscience, and the deepest learning still happens in relationship. Between a person who knows and a person who is learning, between a patient teacher and a curious student, between an elder who cares about the future and a young person who's ready to receive what is being offered. None of this was invented by schools. Schools inherited it. The very best schools, the very best teachers, are the ones who understand that they are not doing something new. They are continuing something ancient. They are the latest link in a chain that goes back to the first fire, the first story, the first patient hand guiding a young one. The classroom has walls. The old classroom did not. But the learning, the real learning, the kind that changes who you are and what you can do in the world, that has always happened in the space between one human being and another. It happened in the warm orange glow of a fire circle, when an elder began to speak and the children leaned in close. It happened in a medieval workshop when a master's hands moved and an apprentice's eyes followed every motion. It happened on the open ocean when a navigator pointed at the horizon and said, "That is where we are going, and here is how we will find our way." It happened in a forest when a healer reached down to touch a leaf and said quietly, "This one, remember this one." It happens now, tonight, wherever someone who knows is willing to sit beside someone who is learning and say, "Let me show you." That is education. That is how it has always been. And that is one of the most calming, most reassuring things I know. Part 19. The soft light of what was known. Let us rest here for just a little while longer. Picture an ancient village at dusk. The light is going golden across thatched rooftops. Somewhere, a fire is being lit for the evening meal. The smell of something warm is drifting through the cool air. Children are coming in from the fields and the riverbanks and the edges of the forest, carrying the small things they have gathered and made and caught. Their hands are dirty and capable. Their eyes are bright and tired. An old woman is sitting on a low stone bench near the centre of the village. She has a face like a map, every line telling you something about where she has been. The children drift toward her, the way water drifts downhill, naturally, without being asked. They sit at her feet. They are not being made to. They want to be here. She begins to speak. Maybe she is telling a story they have heard before. Some of the older children know the next line before she says it. But they listen anyway, because every time she tells it a little differently, and the differences are where the new things are. Or maybe she is telling something new, something she has been waiting until they were old enough to hear. A story about where the river came from, about why the mountains are shaped the way they are, about what happens to people who forget the rules that the ancestors learned, about how to find your way home when you're very far from it. Her voice is low and unhurried. The fire crackles softly. The stars are beginning to appear. One by one, the children's eyes grow heavy. They will wake up tomorrow knowing something they did not know today, not because they were tested on it, not because they were required to, because it was told to them in the right voice, in the right moment, by someone they trusted, beside a fire that made everything feel warm and safe and worth remembering. This is how humanity kept its knowledge alive for tens of thousands of years, not in books, not in buildings, in voices, in hands, in the patient, continuous, beautiful act of one person turning to another and saying, "Let me tell you what I know. This is who we are." And wherever you are tonight, listening to this, drifting into sleep, you are the result of an unbroken chain of people who did exactly that. People who watched and learned and remembered and passed it on, generation after generation after generation, all the way down to you. The knowledge is still there. It lives in everything you know how to do without thinking. In the way you read a room, in the way you comfort someone who is sad, in the way you know sometimes, without knowing how you know exactly what to do next. You are the heir to all of it, and that is not a small thing, that is everything. Sleep well. You're safe. You're part of a very long and very beautiful story, and tonight it continues, quietly in the gentle dark. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, please give this video a like. It helps more people find their way here when they need a soft place to rest. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. There are many more nights like this one ahead. Thank you for being here. Good night.